What happens when a beloved television icon sits down for what should be a routine chat show appearance, only to find himself ambushed by a host with a personal agenda? The tension in Studio 6B was so thick you could cut it with a knife as Don Johnson, the suave star who made Miami Vice a cultural phenomenon, found himself under attack from a talk show host who seemed determined to humiliate him on live television. What started as promotional banter quickly spiraled into something far more sinister, and by the end of this encounter, America would witness one of the most shocking walkouts in late-night television history. The interview began innocuously enough, with the usual pleasantries and crowd-pleasing anecdotes about Johnson's legendary career. But beneath the surface, something was brewing. The host had done his homework, digging deep into Johnson's past, armed with ammunition that would turn a friendly chat into a character assassination. As the cameras rolled and the studio audience watched in stunned silence, what unfolded was a masterclass in how not to conduct an interview. As professionalism gave way to personal vendetta, this wasn't just another celebrity appearance gone wrong. This was a calculated attack on a man's reputation, delivered with the kind of malicious glee that makes for uncomfortable viewing. The host, emboldened by his position of power and the safety of his own show, pushed boundaries that should never have been crossed. Johnson, a consummate professional with decades of experience handling difficult interviews, found himself in uncharted territory as the conversation took increasingly darker turns. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure you subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments what you think about hosts who cross the line with their guests. Now, let's get into what really happened that night. The studio lights blazed hot as Don Johnson settled into the guest chair, his trademark confident smile masking any apprehension he might have felt. He had been doing these promotional rounds for decades, and this should have been just another stop on the media circuit. The host greeted him with what appeared to be genuine warmth, shaking hands firmly and exchanging the usual pre-interview banter that audiences love to see. But those who knew the host well might have noticed something different in his demeanor. That night, there was an edge to his smile, a glint in his eye that suggested this interview would be anything but routine. As the show returned from commercial break, the host launched into his opening questions with practiced ease, asking about Johnson's latest projects and reminiscing about his iconic roles. The audience was eating it up, laughing at the right moments and applauding when prompted. Johnson, ever the professional, delivered his responses with the charm and charisma that had made him a household name. He spoke eloquently about his craft, shared amusing anecdotes from movie sets, and seemed genuinely engaged with the conversation. The first 15 minutes proceeded exactly as viewers and Johnson himself would have expected. Then something shifted. The host's questions began to take on a more pointed edge. What started as gentle ribbing about Johnson's personal life gradually morphed into something more invasive. The host began referencing tabloid stories from decades past, bringing up failed relationships and business ventures with a tone that was increasingly less playful and more predatory. Johnson's body language began to change subtly. His smile became more forced, his posture slightly more defensive. He handled the initial probing questions with grace, deflecting with humor and maintaining his composure even as the host's line of questioning became more uncomfortable. But the audience could sense the temperature in the room dropping, the easy camaraderie of the early interview giving way to something more tense. The host seemed to feed off this discomfort, pressing harder with each question. He brought up Johnson's past struggles with substance abuse, framing them not as triumphs of recovery but as fodder for mockery. He made snide comments about Johnson's age, his career choices, and even his appearance, all while maintaining the thin veneer of comedic banter that late-night television is known for. What made the situation particularly uncomfortable was how the host weaponized his audience against his guest. Each cutting remark was delivered with a theatrical pause, allowing the crowd to react before moving on to the next verbal assault. Johnson found himself not just defending against the host's attacks, but also trying to win back an audience that was being systematically turned against him. The turning point came when the host decided to dig into territory that should have remained off-limits. With a theatrical clearing of his throat, he pulled out a stack of papers from beneath his desk, making a show of shuffling through them, as if he were a prosecutor preparing to present damning evidence. Johnson's eyes narrowed as he watched this performance, his decades of experience in front of cameras telling him that whatever was coming next would not be pleasant. "So Don," the host began, his voice dripping with false concern, "I've been doing some research, and I came across some really interesting stories about your time on Miami Vice. Now, I know you've talked about how that show changed your life, but there are some things you haven't talked about, aren't there?" The question hung in the air like a sword of Damocles, and Johnson's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Johnson maintained his composure, responding with measured professionalism. "Well, that was a long time ago, and I've always been pretty open about it. My experiences on that show, it was an incredible time in my life, both personally and professionally." But the host wasn't satisfied with this diplomatic response. He pressed forward, his tone becoming more aggressive with each word. "See, that's interesting, because I have some reports here from people who worked on the set, and they paint a very different picture." The host's smile never wavered, but there was something predatory about it now, like a shark that had tasted blood in the water. Johnson's media training kicked in, and he attempted to redirect the conversation. "Look, any long-running television production is going to have its challenges. We were working incredibly long hours, under a lot of pressure, and everyone was passionate about making the best show possible. Sometimes that passion can create friction, but that's true of any creative endeavor." But the host had no intention of letting Johnson off the hook so easily. He continued reading from his papers, citing anonymous sources and unverified claims about Johnson's behavior on set. He painted a picture of an actor who was temperamental, demanding, and difficult to work with, all while maintaining the pretense that this was just friendly conversation between two professionals. The audience, initially uncomfortable with the direction of the interview, began to shift in their seats. Some were clearly enjoying the spectacle, the voyeuristic thrill of watching a celebrity being taken down a peg. Others seemed genuinely uncomfortable, sensing that they were witnessing something that crossed the line from entertainment into cruelty. Johnson's responses became shorter, more clipped. His famous charm was still there, but it was clearly strained. He tried multiple times to steer the conversation back to his current projects, to the positive aspects of his career, but the host seemed determined to keep the focus on every negative story he could dredge up from Johnson's past. "And then there's the matter of your personal relationships," the host continued, his voice taking on an even more salacious tone. "You've been married quite a few times, haven't you, Dan? Some people might say you have trouble with commitment. What would you say to those people?" The question was delivered with a machinist expression that fooled no one. Johnson's face flushed slightly, and for the first time in the interview, his famous composure cracked just a little. "I think my personal relationships are just that." "Personal? I don't see how they're relevant to why I'm here tonight, which is to talk about my work." His voice carried a warning tone that any reasonable interviewer would have heeded, but this host was clearly not reasonable. He seemed energized by Johnson's discomfort, like a bully who had found his victim's weak spot. "Oh, come on, Don. Be so sensitive. Your fans want to know about the real you, not just the Hollywood version. And the real you seems to have a pattern when it comes to relationships, doesn't it?" The host then began listing Johnson's ex-wives and past relationships, making jokes about each one, and implying that Johnson was somehow deficient as a partner and a person. He talked about alimony payments, custody arrangements, and other deeply personal matters that had been tabloid fodder years earlier. All of this was delivered with the kind of gleeful malice that makes for compelling television, but terrible human behavior. Johnson's hands, which had been resting casually on the arms of his chair, were now gripping them tightly. His jaw was set, and his eyes had taken on a steely quality that anyone who knew him well would have recognized as a danger sign. But the host, drunk on his own power and the audience's attention, seemed oblivious to these warning signs. "You know what I find really interesting, Don?" the host continued, leaning forward in his chair, like a spider closing in on its prey. "You've built this whole image of being this cool, smooth operator, this ladies' man, but when you look at the actual track record, it's pretty messy, isn't it? Kind of makes you wonder if the whole Don Johnson persona is just that, a persona." The audience was now completely silent, sensing that they were witnessing something that had gone far beyond normal interview boundaries. Even the host's usual sycophantic sidekick seemed uncomfortable, shifting nervously in his chair and avoiding eye contact with both the host and the guest, Johnson took a deep breath, clearly trying to summon whatever reserves of patience he had left. "I think we should probably move on to something else," he said quietly, his voice carrying an undertone of barely controlled anger. "I came here tonight to talk about my current projects, not to be psychoanalyzed about my personal life." But the host wasn't done. In fact, Johnson's obvious discomfort seemed to encourage him to push even harder. "Oh, but Don, this is all part of the same story, isn't it? The actor, the man, the myth? I mean, let's be honest here. Your career hasn't exactly been setting the world on fire lately, has it? When was your last hit? When was the last time you were relevant?" The words hit Johnson like a physical blow. His entire body tensed, and for a moment, it looked like he might actually leave his chair. The host had crossed a line that even the most aggressive interviewers rarely cross, questioning not just Johnson's personal life, but his professional worth and relevance. "That's enough," Johnson said, his voice low and dangerous. "I don't know what kind of show you think you're running here, but this isn't journalism, it's harassment." The famous Johnson charm was completely gone now, replaced by raw anger and hurt. The host seemed surprised by Johnson's reaction, as if he genuinely hadn't expected his guest to push back. But instead of backing down or apologizing, he doubled down on his attack. "Oh, come on, Don. Don't be such a prima donna. This is just conversation. If you can't handle a few tough questions, maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews." The final straw came when the host reached into his desk drawer and pulled out what appeared to be a police report, waving it in the air with theatrical flourish. Johnson's eyes immediately locked onto the document, and his face went pale as he recognized what it was. The host had somehow obtained records from an incident that had occurred decades earlier, something that had been resolved quietly and kept out of the public eye until now. "Now this is really interesting, Don," the host said, his voice practically dripping with malicious glee. "I have here a police report from 1987. Care to tell our audience what this is about?" The question was delivered with the kind of smug satisfaction that comes from knowing you hold all the cards in a particularly cruel game. Johnson's voice was barely above a whisper when he responded. "That matter was resolved a long time ago. It was a misunderstanding that was cleared up, and I'm not going to discuss it on your show or anywhere else." His hands were now visibly shaking, whether from anger or humiliation. It was impossible to tell, but the host pressed on, clearly savoring every moment of Johnson's discomfort. "A misunderstanding. That's an interesting way to put it, because according to this report, you were arrested for disturbing the peace and public intoxication. The officers noted that you were belligerent and uncooperative. Doesn't sound like much of a misunderstanding to me." The audience was now completely silent, the earlier laughter and applause replaced by an uncomfortable tension that filled the studio like a thick fog. Even the cameramen seemed unsure of where to point their cameras. Torn between capturing Johnson's obvious distress and maintaining some semblance of professional dignity, Johnson stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward with the force of his movement. "I'm done with this," he said, his voice carrying across the silent studio with crystal clarity. "This isn't an interview, it's an ambush. And I won't sit here and be humiliated by someone who clearly has his own issues to work through." The host seemed genuinely shocked by Johnson's reaction, as if he had expected his guest to simply sit there and take whatever abuse was dished out. Whoa, Don, where are you going? We're just having a conversation here. Don't you think you're overreacting just a little bit?" Johnson turned to face the host directly, his famous blue eyes blazing with an intensity that made everyone in the studio take notice. "Overreacting? You've spent the last half hour attacking my character, my personal relationships, my career, and my past mistakes. You've humiliated me in front of your audience and millions of viewers at home, and you think I'm overreacting?" The host, perhaps realizing that he had pushed too far, attempted to backtrack. "Look, Don, I'm just doing my job here. People want to know about the real you, not just the sanitized Hollywood version. If you can't handle a few tough questions, maybe you shouldn't be in show business." This comment proved to be the final nail in the coffin of what had already become a disaster of an interview. Johnson's face flushed red with anger, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades of experience in an industry that could be both generous and cruel. "Tough questions. Is that what you call this character? Assassination. I've been doing interviews for over 40 years, and I've answered tough questions from journalists who actually knew how to do their jobs with professionalism and respect. What you've done tonight isn't journalism, it's tabloid trash masquerading as entertainment. The host, now clearly rattled by Johnson's passionate response, tried to regain control of the situation. Now wait just a minute, Don. You came on my show, you sat in my chair, and you agreed to answer my questions. Don't blame me for doing research and asking about things that are part of the public record. Johnson laughed, but there was no humor in it. Public record. You dug up a police report from 35 years ago about an incident that was resolved and forgotten by everyone except apparently you. You've brought up my personal relationships, my private struggles, and every mistake I've ever made. All while pretending this is some kind of legitimate interview. This isn't research, it's stalking. The tension in the studio was now so thick it was almost suffocating. The audience members were looking at each other uncomfortably, clearly unsure of how to react to what they were witnessing. Some seemed to be enjoying the spectacle, but many others appeared genuinely disturbed by the host's treatment of his guest. Johnson began to remove his microphone, his movements deliberate and controlled despite his obvious anger. You know what? The really sad part is, he said, his voice now calm but carrying an undertone of deep disappointment. I came here tonight to talk about my work, to share some stories with your audience, to maybe give them a few laughs and some insight into what it's like to work in this business. Instead, you've turned this into some kind of twisted therapy, the session where you get to play psychologist and I get to be your patient. The host, perhaps sensing that he was losing control of the narrative, tried one last desperate attempt to justify his behavior. Don, I think you're being a little dramatic here. This is late-night television. We poke fun. We ask the questions that other people won't ask. That's what makes it entertaining. Johnson paused in the middle of unhooking his microphone pack, his expression shifting from anger to something approaching pity. Entertaining? You think destroying someone's dignity is entertaining? You think dragging up their lowest moments and presenting them as comedy is what passes for entertainment these days? He shook his head slowly, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. Let me tell you something about entertainment, Johnson continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. I've been entertaining people for most of my adult life. I've made them laugh, I've made them cry, I've given them characters they could root for and stories they could escape into. That's entertainment. What you're doing is something else entirely. The host, now visibly flustered, and perhaps beginning to realize the magnitude of his mistake, attempted to interrupt. Don, come on, let's just calm down here. And no, Johnson cut him off sharply. You don't get to tell me to calm down after what you've just put me through. You don't get to ambush someone and then act surprised when they defend themselves. You've shown your true colors tonight, and they're not pretty. Johnson had now completely removed his microphone and was preparing to leave the stage. The audience was watching in stunned silence, many of them appearing to be in shock at what they had witnessed. Even the host's band seemed uncomfortable, their usual smiles replaced by looks of confusion and concern. You want to know what's really entertaining? Johnson asked, turning back to face the host one final time. Watching you try to justify what you've done here tonight, watching you pretend that this was all in good fun, that this was just business as usual. The truth is, you've embarrassed yourself far more than you've embarrassed me. The host, his face now red with a mixture of anger and humiliation, made one final attempt to salvage the situation. Fine, Don. If you want to storm off like a child having a tantrum, that's your choice. But don't blame me for asking the questions that your fans deserve to have answered. Johnson stopped dead in his tracks, his hand already on the curtain that would take him backstage. He turned around slowly, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried clearly throughout the silent studio. My fans, he said, emphasizing each word carefully, deserve better than this. They deserve better than watching someone they admire being torn down for cheap laughs. They deserve better than seeing their entertainment come at the expense of someone's human dignity. And frankly, they deserve a better host than you. With that, Johnson pushed through the curtain and disappeared backstage, leaving behind a stunned studio audience and a host who suddenly seemed to realize that he had made a terrible mistake. The camera lingered on the empty guest chair for a moment before cutting to a clearly rattled host who struggled to find words to fill the uncomfortable silence. The host's attempts to explain what had just happened came across as desperate and unconvincing. He tried to make jokes about Johnson's departure, but the audience wasn't laughing anymore. He attempted to justify his line of questioning. Even his most loyal fans could see that he had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. What had started as what should have been a routine. Promotional interview had turned into a masterclass in how not to treat a guest, how not to conduct an interview, and how not to entertain an audience. The host had allowed his own ego and desire for viral moments to override basic human decency, and the result was a train wreck that would be remembered long after. Johnson's actual work was forgotten. The entire incident served as a stark reminder of the power dynamic that exists between talk show hosts and their guests, and how that power can be abused when it falls into the wrong hands. Johnson, a consummate professional with decades of experience, had been reduced to walking off a set because he refused to be complicit in his own humiliation. The aftermath in the studio was palpable. Audience members sat in uncomfortable silence, many of them looking as if they wished they could leave as well. The host's usual confident demeanor had crumbled, replaced by a desperate attempt to regain control of a situation that had spiraled completely out of his hands. Even his production team seemed rattled, unsure of how to proceed after witnessing such a complete breakdown of professional standards. As the show cut to commercial break, one thing was crystal clear. This wasn't just an interview gone wrong. This was a complete failure of leadership, professionalism, and basic human decency. All broadcast lived for millions to see. Johnson had shown dignity in the face of deliberate provocation, while the host had revealed himself to be exactly what Johnson had accused him of being, a bully hiding behind the facade of entertainment. That's the incredible story of one of the most shocking walkouts in late-night television history. Make sure you subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories like this one. And let me know in the comments, do you think talk show hosts should have limits on what they can ask their guests? Or is everything fair game in the name of entertainment?